If you carry me upstairs, I will tell you a secret." The sentence arrived like a knock on glass in a silent house. Evan Price had one boot still inside the revolving door and one boot out on the slick marble, the faint smell of motor oil rising from his jacket where the wind had cooled it. Outside, autumn had lowered its gray lid over the city. The gutters were full of copper leaves, and a brittle light the color of old brass slid across the mirrored towers. Inside the upscale apartment complex, everything was clean angles and quiet money, a chandelier whispering light down through a shaft of air, a concierge desk of black stone, a grand staircase whose banister shone like a blade. She sat at the bottom of those stairs, knees tucked under her like a folded bird. The teddy bear she held was the sort of bear that had lost more battles than it ever won. Fur-worn thin, one button eye turned to the side like a moon in a cloud. Her hair was a dark tumble that framed a face too pale for a child, and around the small wrist that clutched the bear, a plastic band, white and stubborn, stamped with the small arithmetic of hospitals, letters, numbers, a date. Evan looked left, right, as if the sentence might have come from someone else, a prank, a joke, a ventriloquism of the building. But the little girl was watching him with a calm that did not belong to an afternoon in October. He had delivered a graphite sedan to a resident in the garage 2 minutes earlier. The invoice still sat folded in his pocket. There had been a cough, thin and scraping, that had made him turn. Then the sentence. Now the choice, as old as time, as simple as 2 doors. Keep walking, or kneel down and enter a story he had not planned to live. He knelt. "What is your name?" His voice came out lower than he expected, as if the lobby, with its echoed marble and glass, required gentleness. "Sophie," she said, studying him the way children study the weather, measuring whether to trust it. "I can walk, but the stairs make my lungs feel like the bad kind of balloons." "What kind is that?" "The kind that squeak when you try to tie them." He smiled before he could stop himself. She noticed, like a small accountant tallying debts and credits. Her gaze dipped to his hands, which were nicked and blackened from years in the garage, then lifted back to his eyes. "You have strong arms," she observed, "and you look like the kind of person who doesn't drop things." He considered this. "I try not to," he said. "So," she concluded, as if finishing a proof, "you can carry me." The concierge at the desk looked up, then down again. People crossed the lobby with the careful speed of those who have alibis for where they are going. Evan glanced toward the elevator bank. "Where are we going?" he asked. "3rd floor," Sophie said. "End of the hall." "We live in the far, far one. My mom likes corners. They feel safer, like there is less universe to guard." She tipped her head toward the stairs, a queen granting a permission. "Up we go." He slipped one arm under her knees and one behind her back, as he had once been taught to carry engines and fragile things. She was lighter than he expected, the bear heavier than it looked. As he rose, she leaned into him with an ease that felt planned, like she had rehearsed this moment in her mind and now was merely confirming the choreography. Her breath touched his collar like a moth. They climbed. The staircase spiraled slowly beneath them, each step a soft drum. On the first landing, she said, "I used to run this, 2 at a time." "Used to?" "Before the squeaky balloons." He said nothing. The building breathed around them. An invisible ventilation, distant doors opening, a muffled laugh from a floor above. His world, for years, had been sockets and belts, valves and misfires, the soft logic of machines that will tell you what they need if you listen hard enough. The world in his arms now had a different logic. A small forehead that was warmer than the room. A hospital band bite-marked from where fingers had worried it. A bear whose seam at the shoulder had been stitched twice by hands, not skilled at sewing but stubborn in love. On the second landing, she said softly, "About the secret." "What about it?" "It is not about me." "All right." "It is about my mom." She paused as if testing the strength of a bridge before crossing. "She is very lonely." The words did not ask permission. They only asked to be heard. He adjusted his hold and kept climbing. Outside, a siren combed the street, rising and falling as if raking leaves. He knew loneliness as a weather pattern, knew the way it changed a person's posture. He had watched it visit the garage in lean months, had felt it come to live in his apartment after his sister died, and the small, stubborn defiance that had kept him moving dulled to a practical silence. But the truth of loneliness spoken by a child has a different weight, like a bell struck deep within stone. They reached the third floor. The carpet here was the color of red wine in shadow. The hall, long and quiet, strode away like a private road. He carried Sophie toward the end unit where a thin strip of light leaked from under the door. She touched his collar, cheek close to his ear. "When I am gone," she whispered, the words so soft the air barely moved, "you should take care of her." He stopped walking. The door numbers on the opposite wall seemed to lose their meaning, like numbers do when you stare too hard at them. He did not ask, "Gone where?" He did not ask, "Why me?" The question that rose like a reflex of decency was a smaller one. "Are you in pain right now?" "I am okay right now," Sophie said, in the tone of someone whose job is to keep other people steady. "But I know things." "What things?" She considered. "What a quiet house sounds like after 9 p.m. What my mom looks like when she pretends not to cry. What doctors say when they think you are playing with stickers." He took a breath that tried to escape him as a sigh and forced it back as just a breath. The light under the door widened. The door had opened. Rachel Morgan stood there. She was tall but not imposing, beautiful in the particular way of someone who has been too busy to notice. A navy suit hung from her frame like a well-kept promise, sleeves pushed up as if the day had trailed too far into night. Her black hair was clipped at the nape, some strands having escaped to draw parentheses around eyes that measured him with quick, professional accounting. She held the door with one hand and a phone in the other, and in the space between those two instruments, her life balanced. "Sophie," she said, not sharply and not gently, but with a control built plank by plank across years. "What are you doing? You should not be out here, sweetheart." Sophie's hand tightened on the bear. "He carried me," she said, as if this were both explanation and defense. "His name is Evan. He is strong and does not drop things." Rachel stepped forward, and for a breath, her composure cracked, just enough for worry to glance through. "Thank you," she said, looking at Evan, the thank you careful as porcelain. "I appreciate your help. I am Rachel." She paused, an attorney's reflex to specify the territory of a conversation. "Rachel Morgan." "Evan Price," he said, the name sounding suddenly smaller than a moment ago. He set Sophie down with the caution of setting down a violin. Rachel's gaze took in his jacket with the stitched logo of a neighborhood garage, his rough hands, the small grease sunburst at his cuff. She did not flinch, but her eyes narrowed a millimeter, the way people's eyes do when trying to place a variable in an equation. This is the part where, he knew, life often splinters, the line where kindness meets fear. He did not fault her for it. The world had instructed her thoroughly. "We've got it from here," she said, and reached for Sophie's shoulder. But Sophie was already reaching the other direction, taking Rachel's fingers and Evan's sleeve, trying to connect them like two ends of a wire. "He listens," she said. "He hears the kind of silence that makes your ears ring." Rachel exhaled once, the place where impatience meets gratitude. She turned to Evan. "Would you like some water? Or coffee? I don't have cash to tip." She stopped herself, more annoyed at the sentence than at him. That sounded wrong. I am sorry. I am out of practice with neighbors. It is all right, he said. I was just leaving. Sophie looked up at him, the world's smallest judge. Remember, she whispered, the secret. He nodded, the gesture feeling solemn in the halls of an expensive building. Rachel ushered her daughter inside with an arm that was both armor and wing. Before the door closed, she said more softly now, Thank you again, Mr. Price. Evan, he said, and you are welcome. The door shut. The gold strip at the bottom became a narrow blade of light, then nothing. He stood for a moment in the satin quiet and listened to his own heart behave itself. Then he turned and walked the length of the corridor back toward the elevator, where a column of mirrors multiplied him into a long procession of men trying to look as if they belong. The elevator came with a sigh and took him down through floors of other people's lives. In the lobby, he nodded at the concierge, who pretended not to have seen anything, and out on the street the wind cuffed him like an older brother. He should have gone home. It was his day's last delivery. There was leftover stew in his refrigerator and a stray cat that visited his fire escape, and a book with a folded page he had been trying to finish for months. But his feet carried him not toward the subway entrance yawning under the corner bank, but toward the side of the building where trucks rolled their shoulders and a service ramp led to the garage gate. Work is a refuge when you are not ready to feel. He stood with the mechanics a while, swapping a joke, signing a receipt, listening to the ordinary music of wrenches and radios. Under it all, though, the sentence kept playing, the way a melody keeps returning in a symphony with just enough alteration to make you listen harder. When I am gone, you should take care of her. The audacity of a child's faith. The cruelty of its clarity. He left the garage at dusk, the sky the dark purple of a bruise healing. As he reached the street, rain began to stipple the pavement. He pulled his collar up and started walking toward the train. 2 blocks later, he stopped at a florist that kept late hours for the late-hearted. He bought nothing. He stood inside the humid air for a moment and looked at marigolds clustered like small suns. He would not have known the name if his sister had not planted them everywhere in the last summer of her life, laughing at their stubborn cheer. When he stepped back into the rain, he could almost smell that old July in the wet October air. At home, in the narrow apartment that had grown larger since she'd gone, he hung his jacket on the back of a chair and stood a long time looking at nothing. The city went on without his permission. A neighbor practiced a scale on the piano, always losing the same note and finding it again. Somewhere a radio advertised a sale on tires. He sat on the edge of his bed, the mattress exhaling dust, and opened the book with the folded page. He read 2 lines, 3, and put it down. The next morning, he woke before his alarm with the uneasy certainty that he had left something unfinished. He made coffee. He shaved. He oiled a squeak in his bathroom door. He told himself that the proper thing to do was nothing. He told himself that people do not need strangers arriving at their doors with good intentions, like bouquets that will not live long. He told himself he had been asked to carry a child up a flight of stairs, and he had. That should be the end of it. By 9, he had convinced himself that this was true. By 9:05, he was beneath the hood of a pickup, whose engine sounded like an old man clearing his throat and thinking better of it. By 9:10, he had washed his hands and walked back onto the sidewalk. By 9:20, he was 2 blocks from the apartment building without remembering that he had chosen to go. He did not bring flowers. He brought nothing but his hands and the silence in which he was competent. In the lobby, he nodded again at the concierge, who gave him a look that translated roughly to you again, and still typed his polite nothing on the computer. The elevator carried him up with its knitted, indifferent patience. He walked the red wine corridor to the far, far door. He lifted his knuckles to knock and paused, as if remembering a prayer he did not believe in. Then he knocked. It was not Rachel who opened. It was Sophie, small and fierce in blue pajamas patterned with yellow stars. Her hair had been domesticated into two small braids that already wanted to escape. The bear rode in the crook of one arm like an old soldier. "You came back," she said, as if they had a contract. "I was in the neighborhood," he lied gently. "People always say that," she replied, amused. "Come in." He hesitated on the threshold and then crossed into a home that smelled faintly of lemons and the rain that had followed him upstairs. The living room was arranged with the efficiency of a mind used to making order from trouble. Files stacked on a low table, a laptop asleep, a row of law books like a brick wall against an invader. A sweater flung across the back of a chair had surrendered to gravity. A mug with a lipstick ghost waited on the counter. The window looked out over a city that pretended to be infinite. Rachel stepped from the hallway, tying the belt of a robe. If surprise touched her face, it was practiced at not staying long. "Mr. Price," she said. "Evan," he answered. He held his hands in front of him as if he might otherwise touch something fragile. "I wanted to make sure you were all right after last night. Both of you." "We are fine," Rachel said. The sentence was courteous but carried a metal core. She glanced toward Sophie, who had already climbed onto the sofa and was examining Evan's boots with the interest of a museum curator. "Sophie, why don't you—" "I am not made of spun sugar," Sophie said without looking up. "I am made of bones and very brave cells." "Soph," Rachel warned gently. "It is true," Sophie insisted, and then, with the timing of a magician changing scarves, smiled brightly at Evan. "Would you like tea?" "I would," he said, surprised to discover it was true. "Thank you." Rachel moved to the kitchen with the long-practiced grace of someone turning chaos into courtesy. Water filled the kettle like a small rainstorm. The room, in the brief space between words, hummed with the electricity of new people learning the size of each other's shadows. Evan took a breath and found the sentence again, the one that had been living at the back of his ribs since last night. "When I carried her upstairs," he said to Rachel, not quite meeting her eyes, "she told me a secret. I do not know if—" "I know what she told you," Rachel said, setting the kettle on the flame. Her voice was even, but the edges of it glowed. "Sophie believes in deputizing strangers. She believes the world is full of people who can be asked to help keep it from falling apart." "It is not a bad belief," he said. "It is an expensive one," Rachel replied, and then softened. "Forgive me. I am grateful. You were kind, Mr. Price." "Evan." "Evan," she repeated, as if trying it on. The kettle began to murmur. "We are fine," she said again, but the second time the sentence was thinner, truer, the kind of fine that means not drowning yet. Sophie slid off the sofa and came to stand between them, small and resolute. She took her mother's hand in one of hers and, without asking, took Evan's in the other. She lifted both hands, joining them briefly in the air the way a conductor might, making a bridge of fingers. "Say," she said, "less universe to guard." Rachel did not pull away. Evan did not either. For a breath, 3 people stood in a room the size of 1,000 rooms, and the house that loneliness had built around each of them found a door that had not been there yesterday. The kettle began to sing. The first time after that night, it happened in the lobby. Evan had just come off a 12-hour shift at the garage, grease still under his nails, his shoulders carrying the ache of a day that refused to be done. The sky outside was gray with the dull weight of November, the kind that pressed against windows and made you think of soup, of fireplaces you didn't have. He was on his way to drop off a spare part to a resident's sedan in the underground garage when the elevator doors opened and Sophie stepped out. She wore a knit hat shaped like a fox's head, the ears twitching slightly as she walked. In her hands, she carried a sheet of hospital stickers, the kind that nurses handed to children who had been brave. She peeled one off, the cartoon face smiling too wide, and pressed it into his palm without ceremony. "For the brave," she said, as if this were an official award. Evan glanced at the sticker, then at her, a corner of his mouth lifting. "I didn't do anything brave today." "Yes, you did," she answered, as though she'd been keeping score in a game only she knew the rules to. "You came back." Before he could reply, Rachel appeared from around the corner, her phone pressed to her ear, her stride clipped and deliberate. She offered him a polite nod. The kind people give to a neighbor they've spoken to once. Then she steered Sophie toward the door without breaking the cadence of her conversation. Sophie, of course, twisted in her mother's grasp just enough to wave at him. The second time was in the hallway. Evan was changing a light bulb in one of the wall sconces, something the building maintenance guy usually handled, but the man was out sick, and Evan, being in the garage crew, had been asked as a favor. The fixture was warm under his palm when he heard the faint, steady rhythm of someone's steps. Sophie rounded the corner, clutching a paper heart folded from a magazine page. "This one's for you," she said, holding it out. "I made it while Mom was on the phone with a client. She talks in circles when she's with clients, so I can make 3 hearts before she notices." He took it carefully, noting the uneven creases and the way her small hands had pressed the paper into obedience. "Thanks. I'll keep it in my toolbox." "You have a toolbox?" Her eyes widened as if he had confessed to owning a dragon. "You should put it in the safe part, where the screwdrivers don't scratch it." Rachel's voice floated from the far end of the hall. "Sophie, shoes!" Her tone was part command, part warning. Sophie grinned at him before skipping off, her fox ear hat bouncing. The third time was outside. It was a rare, bright afternoon in the city, sunlight dripping like honey over the sidewalks. Evan had taken his lunch break on the bench near the corner cafe, a paper cup of coffee warming his palms. He spotted them coming from the opposite direction. Rachel in a navy coat, walking briskly, Sophie holding her hand but hopping over every crack in the pavement. When they reached the corner, a gust of wind pulled Sophie's hat halfway off her head. Evan caught it before it could tumble into the street. She laughed and declared, "See? Doesn't drop things." Rachel's mouth softened just a fraction. "Thank you," she said. And this time the thank you sounded less like porcelain and more like fabric, still guarded but warmer. From then on, it became a quiet pattern. In the mornings, he'd sometimes pass them in the lobby, Sophie's hair damp from the shower, Rachel scanning her phone as they waited for the elevator. In the evenings, he'd catch sight of them returning from the grocery store, Rachel balancing bags while Sophie insisted on carrying the lightest one herself. Sophie's gifts kept coming. Stickers, folded paper shapes, once even a small plastic dinosaur she claimed needed a braver home. And each time, Rachel would hover at the edge of the exchange, her posture careful, as though she were weighing the risk of letting this man, with his oil-stained jacket and quiet eyes, orbit too close to their small, fragile world. But Evan never pushed. He never asked questions he wasn't invited to. He simply accepted each gift with the same steady gratitude, tucking them away as if they were pieces of a puzzle he didn't yet know he was building. What Rachel didn't see, couldn't know, was how much he noticed in return. The faint shadows under her eyes that deepened as the weeks passed. The way she scanned every lobby, every hallway, as if cataloging exits. How she always positioned herself between Sophie and anyone else in the room. And the way Sophie looked at him, not with the hero worship of a child toward a firefighter or a movie star, but with the trust of someone who has decided, quietly and without fanfare, that you will keep your promises. Evan had not promised her anything since that night, not out loud, but he carried her words the way he carried that paper heart in his toolbox, in a safe place, away from anything that might crush it. He didn't know why yet, but he had a feeling he would. The rain started as a whisper against the garage roof, thin, almost polite, before the wind found its voice. By the time Evan closed the hood of the last car, the whisper had turned to a roar. He stood at the open bay door, wiping his hands on a rag, and watched the street dissolve under sheets of water. The gutters had begun to choke on leaves, sending rivulets across the pavement like veins on a storm map. November storms in the city had their own kind of violence. They didn't scream like summer squalls, they pushed and pulled, making the air heavy, making everything you touched feel colder than it should. The wind funneled down the narrow streets, bending umbrellas inside out and sweeping away the careless. He was locking up when his phone buzzed. Rachel Morgan. The name on the screen froze him, absurdly. She had never called him before, never even hinted that she might. He answered on the second ring. Her voice was tight, clipped. "Evan, it's Sophie." "She's burning up, trouble breathing. I've called an ambulance, but they said the roads are blocked downtown. The water's up to—" Her words broke under the sound of Sophie's cough in the background. Low, wet, relentless. "I'm coming," he said. No hesitation. No thought for the rest of the shift or the late hour. Just the image of a little girl in fox-ear hat, now flushed and gasping. He drove like the streets were a test of loyalty. The rain pounded the windshield in heavy fists, the wipers thrashing to keep up. Every turn was a gamble. The tires hissed on water-slick asphalt, and more than once he passed a stranded car with its hazards blinking like tiny heartbeats in the dark. The apartment building loomed out of the downpour like a ship in fog. He didn't bother with the lobby. He took the service stairwell 2 at a time, heart hammering in his throat. When Rachel opened the door, she looked like she'd been fighting the storm inside as much as out. Her hair clung to her face, her blouse was damp from holding a wet towel to Sophie's head. The girl lay curled on the couch under a thin blanket, her breath shallow, her cheeks flushed crimson against the white pillow. "She needs the hospital now," Evan said, his voice sharper than he intended. "I know." Rachel's eyes were wide, not with defiance, but with something far rarer in her, fear stripped of armor. "But the streets—" "I'll get her there." He didn't wait for permission. He slid his arms under Sophie, feeling the heat rolling off her small body. She whimpered, her fingers finding the fabric of his jacket, holding on like a child grips a dream before waking. The stairwell felt narrower with her in his arms, the storm's howl louder. The wind shoved against the door when he pushed outside, rain lashing his face. He shielded her as best he could, the world around them reduced to water and motion and the sound of her breathing, a sound he was determined not to let fade. His truck was parked at the curb, the only vehicle that looked ready for this weather. Rachel climbed in beside Sophie, holding her upright against her shoulder. Evan drove with both urgency and caution, threading through half-submerged streets, his knuckles pale on the wheel. The city had become a maze of blocked roads and blinking lights. Once, when a wave from a passing bus slammed against the side of the truck, Sophie stirred and whispered something. He leaned closer to hear her over the rain. "You're not dropping me," she murmured, and tried to smile. "Not a chance," he said. When they reached the ER, the sliding doors parted like a promise. Nurses swept Sophie from his arms into the fluorescent brightness beyond, their voices efficient but edged with concern. Rachel started to follow but stopped, just long enough to look at him. For a moment, the storm outside didn't matter. She reached out, touched his sleeve, not for balance, not for thanks, but as if to anchor herself to something steady. Then she turned and went in. Evan stayed where he was, rain pooling around his boots, staring through the glass until Sophie's small form disappeared behind a curtain. He didn't notice the cold until the adrenaline began to drain, leaving only the ache in his chest. In the waiting room, he sat beside Rachel without speaking. Words felt like an intrusion here. He only set his hand on her shoulder, lightly, so she could shrug it off if she wanted. She didn't. The storm outside rattled the windows, but in that narrow strip of time between fear and news, the three of them, one in a hospital bed, two in plastic chairs, were connected by something wordless and unyielding. The night bled into morning without anyone noticing. The storm had passed while they sat in the waiting room, but the air inside the hospital stayed heavy, as if the weather had taken up residence in people's chests. Nurses came and went with the muted urgency of those accustomed to emergencies. Rachel sat hunched forward in a plastic chair, her elbows on her knees, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles blanched. She hadn't spoken in over an hour. Across from her, Evan leaned against the wall, arms folded, trying to look calm. In truth, he was listening for every sound. A cough, a call, the footsteps of someone bringing news. When the doctor finally appeared, it was with the air of a man who carried gravity in his coat pocket. He was tall, silver-haired, and moved slowly, as if each step required choosing the right words. "Ms. Morgan?" Rachel stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor. "Yes. How is she?" The doctor glanced at Evan before answering, as though weighing whether he was family. Rachel noticed and said, "He stays. Please." The doctor nodded. "Your daughter has acute lymphoblastic leukemia. It's advanced. We've started her on stabilizing medication tonight, but this is aggressive. The best option is a bone marrow transplant, and the sooner we find a match, the better her chances." The words seemed to hang in the air, foreign and impossible. Rachel's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes shifted from the doctor's face to the floor tiles, as if reading them might offer another outcome. "What are her odds?" she managed. The doctor hesitated. With a perfect donor match and prompt transplant, her prognosis improved significantly. Without it, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. "We'll begin testing family members immediately. Siblings, parents." "It's just me," Rachel said quietly. "Her father isn't in the picture." "Then we'll need to test you," the doctor said gently. "And we'll search the donor registry, but time is critical." She nodded, though the motion looked mechanical, her mind elsewhere. How much time? Days, maybe weeks, before her condition worsens. Rachel closed her eyes briefly, as though steadying herself against an invisible wind. When she opened them, she was all lawyer again, straight-backed, precise. "Do what you need to. Test me now." The doctor placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll be in touch as soon as we have results." He left, his footsteps soft against the linoleum, leaving behind the smell of antiseptic and the echo of urgency. Rachel sank back into the chair. Her gaze was fixed, straight ahead, but she wasn't seeing the wall. She was seeing Sophie's fox ear hat, the way it tilted when she laughed. She was seeing all the mornings they'd rushed through breakfast, the afternoons when she'd been too tired from court to notice the drawings Sophie left on her desk. "She's strong," Evan said quietly. Rachel's head turned toward him. "She's 6, she said, and the words carried both pride and heartbreak. "She shouldn't have to be strong." He didn't argue. Some truths didn't need to be softened. Hours passed in fragments, nurses checking vitals, Rachel pacing the corridor, Evan stepping out for coffee and returning with one for her, though she let it go cold. At one point, a nurse mentioned that Sophie had been asking for the man who doesn't drop things. Rachel allowed him into the room. Sophie lay small in the hospital bed, her skin too pale against the white sheets. But her eyes lit up when she saw him. "You came," she murmured. "Wouldn't miss it," he said, pulling up a chair. Rachel stood in the doorway watching them. For a moment, she didn't see a mechanic and a stranger. She saw someone steady enough to carry her child through a storm without flinching. Someone who, without being asked, had shown up and stayed. But even as that thought warmed her, another crept in. How fragile everything was now. How every decision she made from here on would be measured against the clock the doctor had just wound in her mind. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by Sophie's bed, the monitors softly ticking away the seconds. Evan had gone home hours earlier, though she knew he hadn't wanted to. She kept replaying the doctor's words. Perfect donor. Sooner. Time is critical. And somewhere, in the quiet between beeps, she felt Sophie stir. "Mom," the little voice whispered. "I know you're scared." "But it's okay." Rachel smoothed her hair back, swallowing hard. "Why would it be okay?" Sophie's eyes half closed, her voice fading into drowsiness. "Because maybe you won't be alone." Rachel sat there long after Sophie fell asleep, the weight of those words pressing against her chest like something both terrifying and hopeful. The days that followed blurred into one another, a haze of hospital corridors and the constant hum of machines. Outside, the city moved on, traffic lights changing, shopkeepers sweeping sidewalks, strangers scrolling their phones. But in Sophie's room, time had a different pace. It was measured in IV drips, nurse rotations, and the quiet rhythm of her breathing when she finally slept. Rachel lived in a state of constant readiness. She kept her blazer hanging on the back of the chair in case she had to step into a meeting via video call. She signed medical consent forms with the same decisiveness she used in court, but her eyes always flickered toward Sophie's bed as she handed them back. Evan came every day. He never announced his arrival. Rachel simply began to expect him. Sometimes he brought a cup of tea for her, sometimes a book for Sophie, sometimes nothing at all but his steady presence. He seemed to understand the unspoken rules of the room, when to speak, when to listen, when to let silence do the work. One afternoon, Rachel had stepped out to talk with the doctor. Sophie, propped up by pillows, was flipping slowly through a picture book, but not really reading. When she saw Evan, her face brightened. "Guess what?" she said, her voice still thin from the illness. "Mom says they're still looking for someone to give me, what is it called?" "A bone marrow transplant," Evan replied. "Right." She nodded solemnly, then leaned closer. "I'm not scared, you know." He smiled faintly. "You're not?" "Nope. Not if you promise to take care of Mom when I'm gone." The words hit him like the cold edge of winter air. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Sophie, don't talk like that. You're not going anywhere." Her gaze didn't waver. "Promise me." Evan hesitated. He thought of the first night they met, her small voice whispering about her mother's loneliness. He thought of the storm, of carrying her through rain so hard it blurred the world. And he thought of Rachel, tired, guarded, carrying a weight she wouldn't put down. "I promise," he said finally, his voice low, steady. A flicker of relief crossed her face. "Okay. Then I can be brave." She reached for his hand, her small fingers curling around his. The moment was quiet, but absolute, like a contract signed in a language only they spoke. Rachel returned a few minutes later, her eyes catching the scene but saying nothing. If she wondered about the silence between them, she didn't ask. That night after he left, Evan didn't go straight home. He sat in his truck with the engine off, the hospital's neon sign glowing faintly on the windshield. The promise felt heavy, not in a way that burdened him, but in a way that reminded him it was real. The next morning, he began making calls. He registered as a marrow donor. He reached out to an old Navy buddy who worked in a hospital upstate. He asked friends, co-workers, even the mailman if they knew how to join the registry. He scoured online forums for support groups and donor networks. At the garage, between oil changes, he sat with his phone pressed to his ear, leaving messages for people he hadn't spoken to in years. He didn't tell Rachel what he was doing. He didn't want to offer hope until he had something solid in his hands. By the end of the week, his name was on every list he could find. It was a small act in the face of something so large, but it was action. And action was the only antidote he knew to helplessness. One evening, as he left the hospital, Sophie's voice followed him out the door, the same way it had in the apartment hallway weeks before. "Remember," she called, "you promised." And he did. Every step toward the parking lot, every turn of the key in the ignition, every mile he drove home, he carried it with him, like a compass that had already chosen the direction for him. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Rachel had been sitting by Sophie's bed, reading briefs on her laptop with one eye and watching the rise and fall of her daughter's chest with the other. When the phone rang, she answered on the first buzz, expecting another update from her office. "Miss Morgan," said the familiar, even voice of Dr. Patel, "we've located a perfect bone marrow match for Sophie." For a moment, Rachel could only breathe out a shaky, "Oh, thank God." Her eyes flicked immediately to Sophie, who was coloring half-heartedly in a sketch pad. "We'll arrange the transplant as soon as possible," Dr. Patel continued. "The donor has already undergone preliminary testing and has given full consent. They wish to remain anonymous, but I can assure you the match is ideal." Rachel swallowed the sudden lump in her throat. "Please thank them for me, whoever they are. They're saving her life." Within days, everything accelerated. Consent forms, surgical schedules, blood tests. It was a blur of medical terminology and clipped hallway conversations. Sophie, surprisingly, was the calmest of them all, holding her fox ear hat in her lap like a talisman and telling the nurses, "I've got someone watching out for me." The transplant day arrived on a morning painted in pale winter light. Evan showed up early, a paper bag of muffins in one hand, coffee in the other. "Thought you might need fuel," he said, setting them down on the little rolling table beside Rachel. She managed a tired smile. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he replied simply, taking a seat in the corner. Sophie beamed at him from the bed. "See? He doesn't drop things." Rachel noticed the way he stayed until the medical team wheeled Sophie toward the operating room. He didn't say much, just touched the back of Sophie's hand briefly, his thumb brushing against hers before letting go. The procedure lasted hours. Rachel paced the waiting room, her heels clicking against the tile. Every so often she would glance toward the doors, as though expecting to see the anonymous donor walking past. Whoever they were, they had given her something she could never repay. When the surgeon finally came out, his face relaxed. She knew before he spoke that it had gone well. "She's in recovery," he said. Everything went smoothly. Rachel sagged into the nearest chair, covering her face with both hands. "Thank you." The days following the transplant were a cautious dance between relief and vigilance. Sophie's body would need time to accept the new marrow, but the doctors were optimistic. Rachel spent every moment at her side, talking softly, reading aloud, even when Sophie slept. It wasn't until nearly a week later that she noticed something strange. Evan had been absent for several days, something that had never happened since Sophie's hospitalization. When he finally appeared, it was at the garage. She had decided to stop by on her way back from picking up some clothes at home. He was at his workbench, his right arm wrapped in fresh bandages from wrist to elbow. His face looked drawn, paler than usual, with the kind of fatigue that lived in the bones. "What happened to you?" she asked, stepping closer. He looked up, startled, as though he hadn't expected her. "Just recovering from something. Nothing to worry about." Her eyes narrowed. "Evan, tell me." He hesitated, then set down the wrench in his hand. "It wasn't nothing. I was the donor." Rachel froze. "You?" He nodded. "They said I was a perfect match." I didn't want to tell you until it was done in case it didn't work out." Her breath caught, not from disbelief, but from the sudden swell of gratitude that threatened to undo her. "Why? Why would you—" "It wasn't because I wanted you to owe me," he said quickly, "and not even just for her. It was because she asked me to promise, and I keep my promises." Her vision blurred, and she realized too late that her eyes were wet. She stepped forward and, without thinking, reached for his uninjured arm. "You didn't have to." "I did," he interrupted softly. "For her. And maybe for you, too." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air in the garage smelled faintly of oil and rain, but underneath it was something else, something like trust, finally taking root. The first sign Sophie was winning came in the smallest way. She asked for pancakes. It was 3 weeks after the transplant. Winter had settled over the city like a thick quilt, muffling the streets in pale light. Sophie's cheeks, once drained of color, had begun to hold a faint blush again. Her hair still clung in wisps to her head, but her eyes were brighter, and when she smiled, it was with something more than effort. Rachel had been sitting beside her bed when Sophie announced, in the clear, no-nonsense tone only children have, "On my birthday, I want pancakes, with blueberries, and a candle in the middle." Rachel glanced at the calendar and felt her throat tighten. "Your birthday is next week." "Exactly," Sophie said, as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. From that moment, the plan took root. The hospital staff, charmed as always by Sophie's stubborn optimism, offered to help decorate the pediatric wing's lounge. Rachel's colleagues sent a stack of wrapped gifts to the apartment, which she smuggled in under her coat so Sophie wouldn't see. When Evan heard, he only nodded. "Tell me what time," he said. The morning of Sophie's birthday arrived crisp and bright, the kind of winter day where sunlight glanced off the frost like scattered glass. Rachel helped Sophie into a pale, yellow dress, loose enough not to irritate the central line in her chest, and a cardigan soft enough to be worn over healing skin. The lounge had been transformed. Balloons bobbed against the ceiling. A paper banner reading Happy 6th, Sophie, stretched across the far wall. In the center of the room was a small table with a plate stacked high with blueberry pancakes, steam curling upward like a quiet blessing. Sophie's friends from the ward gathered, some in wheelchairs, others in hospital gowns, all wearing party hats the nurses had made. The air was warm with the smell of maple syrup and the gentle hum of laughter. Evan arrived just as they were lighting the candle. He carried a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Rachel noticed his hair was still damp from the cold outside. "Sorry I'm late," he said, setting the package in front of Sophie. "You're just in time," she grinned. "Sit next to me." She closed her eyes, made a wish Rachel couldn't hear, and blew out the candle. Then, before touching her pancakes, she pulled Evan's gift onto her lap. The brown paper fell away to reveal a small, worn book. The Little Prince. Sophie traced the cover with her fingertips. "What's it about?" "A boy who learns that the most important things can't be seen with the eyes," Evan said. "It belonged to my sister. She used to read it to me when I was your age." Sophie's expression softened. "Then it's special." "It is," he agreed. "And now it's yours." She leaned over and hugged him without hesitation, her thin arms looping around his neck. "You're my favorite grown-up," she declared, and then, turning to the room, added with the straightforward certainty that silenced every conversation, "He's going to take care of my mom when I'm older." The words landed in the space like a stone in still water. Rachel felt every eye shift toward her, but she kept her gaze on Sophie, smiling faintly. "Eat your pancakes, birthday girl." The rest of the morning unfolded in warmth. Sophie laughed until she coughed, then laughed again. She handed out slices of cake to the nurses, making sure even the gruff night shift security guard got one. Evan stayed through it all, helping hang up coats, carrying trays, slipping into the background when Rachel's friends from the firm arrived, but never quite leaving her line of sight. Later, when the guests had gone and Sophie had fallen asleep with the little prince resting open on her chest, Rachel found Evan in the corridor, leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets. "She's never going to forget today," Rachel said quietly. "Neither will I," he answered. For a moment, they stood there in the stillness, the muted hospital lights casting soft shadows across the floor. Outside, snow had begun to fall, slow, deliberate flakes that seemed in no rush to touch the ground. Rachel realized she no longer felt like she was waiting for the next crisis. For the first time in months, she was just here. And Evan was here too. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. The first sign came quietly, almost politely, as if it didn't want to cause alarm. Sophie had been home from the hospital for nearly 3 weeks. The apartment smelled of cinnamon from the candles Rachel lit each evening, and the kitchen table was slowly vanishing under a pile of Sophie's drawings. Stars, foxes, flowers, always in pairs. Rachel had begun to let herself believe the worst was behind them. But one evening, as Evan stopped by with takeout, Rachel noticed Sophie was quieter than usual. She lay curled on the couch, the fox-ear hat pulled low, her cheeks flushed, not with the healthy pink of recovery, but a deeper, hotter shade. "Soph?" Rachel knelt beside her, brushing a hand across her forehead. It was warm, too warm. "I'm just tired," Sophie murmured. Rachel met Evan's eyes over Sophie's head. No words, just the silent exchange that had grown between them these past months. He set the takeout down without opening it. By morning, Sophie's fever had climbed, and her breathing was shallow again. The pediatric oncologist's voice over the phone was calm but firm. "Bring her in immediately." At the hospital, tests were swift and clinical: blood cultures, chest X-ray, oxygen levels. Dr. Patel appeared in the doorway, his expression giving away what his words soon confirmed. "It's a post-transplant infection," he said. "We're starting her on IV antibiotics. Her immune system is still fragile. This can turn quickly." Rachel felt her throat close. "Is she?" She couldn't finish the sentence. "She's in the right place," Dr. Patel said gently. "We'll watch her around the clock." The next days blurred into a tense vigil. Sophie's room became a little island in a sea of beeping monitors and antiseptic air. Evan was there as much as Rachel, sometimes sitting silently by Sophie's bed for hours, sometimes coaxing a smile from her with quiet jokes or folded paper cranes. But Sophie's energy waned. Even speaking seemed to cost her. One night, as the snow outside softened the edges of the city, she called both of them to her bedside. "Sit," she whispered, patting the blanket with a frail hand. Rachel sat on her left, Evan on her right. Sophie reached out and took each of their hands, her small fingers cool but steady. "I think," she began slowly, "it's okay if I'm not here all the time. Because now Mom has you, Evan." "And you promised." Rachel's eyes stung. "Sophie, you're going to get better. Don't." But Sophie shook her head gently. "I'm not scared. I want you both to know I'm happy." Evan's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, resting his forehead briefly against hers. "I'm not letting you go without a fight, kid." Sophie smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth barely lifting. "You fight. I'll rest." That night, Rachel didn't leave her side, even to sleep. Evan stayed in the chair by the window, the snow falling steadily behind him, his silhouette unmoving except for the rise and fall of his breath. The hospital was quiet, but the air was heavy with the kind of stillness that comes before a decision, the kind no one wants to make. The morning. Sophie slipped away began like any other in the hospital. Fluorescent lights humming, nurses making their quiet rounds, the smell of antiseptic and coffee mixing in the air. But Rachel knew, before she even opened her eyes, that the day was different. She had fallen asleep in the chair beside Sophie's bed, her hand resting on her daughter's small fingers. In the early hours, Sophie stirred, her hand curling weakly into Rachel's. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they were clear, like windows after a storm. "Mom," she whispered. Rachel leaned in, brushing a stray strand of hair from Sophie's damp forehead. "I'm here, sweetheart. Always." Sophie's gaze shifted to the other side of the bed, where Evan had dozed in the armchair, his long frame folded awkwardly, as if he hadn't moved all night. "Evan?" Sophie said, her voice so faint it was almost air. He woke instantly, leaning forward, the lines of exhaustion deep in his face. "Hey, kiddo, I'm right here." Her lips curved in the barest smile. "Promise again?" Evan's throat worked before he could speak. "I promise. I'll take care of her." His voice was steady, but his eyes shone. Satisfied, Sophie sighed, a tiny, almost weightless sound. She closed her eyes, her breathing shallow but peaceful. The hours that followed were quiet, marked only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitor and the snow drifting against the window. Rachel spoke softly to her, recounting bedtime stories and summer afternoons in the park. Evan sat on the other side, occasionally reaching over to adjust her blanket or brush his hand against hers. Just after noon, the beeping slowed. A nurse appeared in the doorway, her expression instantly solemn. Rachel felt her chest tighten, a pressure that spread upward into her throat. Sophie opened her eyes one last time. She looked at Rachel, then at Evan, as if she were memorizing their faces. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Just the shape of words they would never forget. "Love you." Her fingers relaxed in Rachel's grasp. The monitor gave a long, unbroken tone. Rachel let out a sound she didn't recognize, half gasp, half sob, as she bent over her daughter, pressing her face into the still warm skin of Sophie's temple. Evan stood, his hand trembling as he rested it on Rachel's shoulder, not to pull her away, but to hold her there, to keep her from collapsing entirely into the grief that had been waiting for this moment. The nurses moved gently, speaking in hushed tones, but Rachel didn't hear them. The world had narrowed to the space between her and Sophie. When at last she let go, it was only to smooth the blanket over Sophie's chest, her hands lingering as if touch could tether her back. Evan reached into his coat and pulled out the worn copy of The Little Prince. He placed it on the bed beside Sophie, sliding a photo between the pages, a picture of her at the birthday party, laughing with a candlelit pancake in front of her. Rachel looked at him through tears. "Why the book?" "Because she should have something that knows her story," he said quietly. The funeral was small, just family, a few close friends, and the nurses who had cared for her. Snow fell steadily, softening the edges of the world. Rachel stood between two rows of marigolds, Sophie's favorite flower, planted by the children from the ward in her honor. Evan stood beside her, silent, his presence steady as the ground under her feet. When the service ended, he bent to place the little prince atop the small casket, the marigold photo tucked inside. Rachel took his hand as they walked away. She didn't know if she could face what came next, but she knew she wouldn't have to do it alone. Winter loosened its grip slowly that year, as if reluctant to leave the streets where Sophie had walked. The snowmelt ran in thin silver streams along the curbs, and the trees in front of the apartment building began to bud with hesitant green. Rachel found herself on the balcony more often than not. It was small, just enough space for 2 chairs and a narrow table, but it faced east, where the morning light spilled over the rooftops. She'd begun keeping a mug of coffee there, letting the warmth sink into her hands as she watched the city wake. It was on one of those mornings that Evan appeared, his jacket unzipped, the faint smell of motor oil following him up the stairs. He was carrying a terracotta pot, cradled carefully in both hands. "Thought you might have room for this," he said. Rachel stepped closer. Inside the pot, bright against the dark soil, was a cluster of marigolds. Their petals were a bold, almost defiant gold, as if the world's grayness had no claim on them. "Sophie's flowers," Rachel murmured, brushing a fingertip over one bloom. "She told me once," Evan said quietly, "that marigolds are like the sun you can keep when it rains." Rachel smiled, though her eyes pricked. She always had a way of making things sound simpler than they were. He set the pot on the table between their chairs. For a moment, neither of them sat. They just stood there, looking at the flowers as if they might speak. Then Rachel pulled out one chair and he took the other. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was the kind that held you, the kind that didn't demand to be filled. "You know," Rachel began, her gaze fixed on the city beyond the balcony, "when she made you promise to take care of me, I thought it was just a child's way of holding on to something. I didn't realize she was giving me permission to let someone in." Evan didn't look away. "She gave me permission too. To stay." They let the words settle, like seeds finding their place in the earth. Below, a breeze carried the faint scent of early blossoms from the park. Somewhere down the block, a street musician played a slow, lilting tune on a saxophone. The sound wove itself into the moment, into the way Rachel's hand rested on the arm of her chair, into the way Evan's fingers reached across the small gap and found hers. She didn't pull away. "I'll keep my promise," he said, his voice steady. "Not because she asked, but because I want to." Rachel turned to meet his eyes. "Then I'll make one too. I'll take care of you." They sat like that, hands joined across the marigolds, the city moving quietly beneath them. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, catching the light in their petals. Sophie wasn't there in body, but she was everywhere else, in the warmth of the sun on their faces, in the gold of the blooms, in the quiet certainty that love, once planted, finds ways to grow. They didn't speak again for a long while. They didn't need to. The promises had been made, and this time, both of them intended to keep them. And in the small balcony garden, the marigolds burned brighter than the morning itself, Sophie's last gift, and the beginning of something new. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story from beginning to end. This has not only been a journey about love and loss, but also a reminder that promises, when kept with the whole heart, can change someone's life. I hope the story of Rachel, Evan, and Sophie has touched you, bringing a little warmth and the belief that even after the greatest losses, love can still bloom. If you found this story meaningful, please share it so that more people can experience it too. Thank you for being part of this journey.